tonight because it's the 20th anniversary of Hostling International New York. Opened up in 1990, so we've been in the community for 20 years now, and we're going to have some different events throughout this year to sort of promote the hostel and sort of our image. I also coordinate the volunteers at the hostel, so if anyone is interested in volunteering with us, please contact me. You can come down to the information desk and talk to me later. But we're just glad that we can have this wonderful chat and learn a little bit more about the history. Of course, this building's a landmark, and I'll lead you to the historical chats. But welcome to the hostel, and I'm glad you're here.
Oh, yes. The microphone doesn't work. No, I have to speak. That's amazing that this place has been open for 20 years. That's almost, I think that's about as much time as it was closed and vacant, and we were all wondering whether it would survive. Well, we're very glad that it did, and this is a real ornament to the neighborhood. It's a terrific place. My name is Gilbert Tauber, and some of you might know me as the guy who conducts the walking tours for the Columbus-Amsterdam bid. And it gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce a fellow, I would say, historian, something more than a history buff, much more than a history buff, believe me. You know, it's great to travel. It's great to visit exotic places, castles, and jungles, and so forth. But there's no satisfaction, I think, like finding stuff that's fascinating about the place you live, about the place that's right under your nose. And I think Jim has made an art of that. He's been a resident of the Upper West Side since 1971, and after a career as a financial executive, he's been pursuing a lifelong interest in New York City history and culture. He's a devoted user of the public library. He's a lifelong runner. He's done 5 New York City marathons. His volunteer experience includes the Big Apple Reader Program, Reedland, the Harlem Children's Zone, and his favorite, the New York Historical Society, where he's a docent and where he has helped me on a couple of occasions with my research. He's also the president of the New York and New Jersey rolling chapter of the Society for Industrial Archaeology. A big hand for the SIA here. Anybody here doesn't know what the Society for Industrial Archaeology is?
Yes.
Well, it's an organization that supports and encourages scholarship in the history of American industry, in our, these vanishing technologies which flourished particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries, and which now have very largely moved offshore. Their relics are still around. We still live with them. Sometimes we live in them because they've been converted to condominiums. Jim is also the founder and head of Weekday Walks. He conducts walks every Wednesday to offbeat areas of New York City. And if you want to find out more about that, his website is www.weekdaywalks.com. Today he comes to us from the Park West Community History Group, which promotes local history and offers presentations at our neighbor library, the Bloomingdale branch, and also at venues like this one. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce my good friend, Jim Macken.
Thank you very
much. So we want to have a lot of fun tonight, and in doing that, I'm going to actually race us through a lot of history that kind of gets us up to where we are on the Upper West Side. So bear with me. If you're taking notes, there's something wrong. So Mary Lee Berenger turns out is the vice president of the rolling chapter of the Society of Industrial Archaeology. She's actually working the machine there.
All the technology.
All the technology. And amongst us is Tom Flagg, an esteemed former president of the Society. So there's a bunch
But you're
of
not using a slide projector.
No.
That's not IA.
So let's see the first slide. Anybody know who this is?
Andrew Green.
Yeah, that's Andrew Haswell Green. I take every opportunity I can to show a picture of this guy. Our borough historian, Mike Micheli, is a champion of him. He conducts a ceremony in the north end of Central Park at the Andrew Haswell Green bench. And the reason he does that is because Andrew Haswell Green is the man that oversaw Olmsted and Vaux when they built the park. He's the man that brought the Metropolitan Museum of Art into the park. He's the man that was a huge backer and financier of the Museum of Natural History. He's the man who, as a law partner to Samuel J. Tilden, was instrumental in pulling together the modern New York Public Library system. And most famously, he's the man that consolidated what was previously the cities of Brooklyn and New York into the larger and greater city of New York. So we start, if we want to get to the west side, we really start with the Native Americans that were here. These are the Lenape Indians. They were here from about 4000 BC. And then, of course, the first European to probably come up on the upper west side was Hendrick Hudson, who was an Englishman hired by the Dutch. And, of course, the Dutch start a colony at the bottom end of Manhattan Island, and then at the north end, they conduct a transaction that's kind of shown here, paying the 60 Dutch guilders. It was actually a president of the New York Historical Society who calculated that the 60 guilders was $24. It turns out that was wrong. It was actually, I think, $669. But does anybody know this handsome-looking gentleman? No, it's not Peter Stuyvesant. That's a good guess. This is James Stewart, the Duke of York. This is where we get our name. He actually got this whole area named after him, obviously, and then later on he becomes King James II. And this is just a favorite image of mine. It's almost like a melody you can't get here. If you start to do what I do, which is start looking for those tulips, you'll find hundreds of them. They're typically in terracotta on buildings around here. In this case, they're in the subway station, but they're all over the place, and they become a very powerful image for what our community becomes. Because our community becomes Bloomingdale Village, you can see up at the top. This is just a section of an 1865 map, and I show it here just to show how many hills and valleys and even water courses that there were before the area got built up. Mary Lee. And in fact, this is Bloomingdale Road. This is actually from a picture image by the great American artist Ralph Blakelock. This would be an early depiction of this Bloomingdale Road, which got built starting in 1703. And it kind of, where Madison Park is today, it kind of veered away from what was another road that is the only road that got you out of Manhattan. And this Bloomingdale Road went up to approximately 122nd Street or so on the west side. So, and then the Revolutionary War comes along, and I mention that because there were skirmishes in our area, and there's an area a few blocks away from here, the Jones Farm, and many of you have probably heard of the Battle of Harlem Heights and Washington Heights. This is the Apthorpe Mansion. And we show this in contrast to, say, the Jamel Mansion, which still exists. The Jamel Mansion is where General Washington actually used it as headquarters for the troops at the time. This mansion was actually used by Sir Hendrick Clinton on the British side as, as their headquarters for a while. And General Clinton is famous. His memoirs attest to Nathan Hale's famous statement where he says, "I regret that I only have but one life to live, for my country." And that comes from General Clinton there. This actually survived well up into the late 1800s. So here's George Washington taking the oath of office. I show this just to remind us that New York City becomes the capital of the United States from approximately 1783, 85 or so, up into the 1790s when it moves to Philadelphia, and then eventually down to Washington, D.C. That railing that Washington is resting on actually is in the New York Historical Society. It got lost for many years. It was over at the old Bellevue Hospital, and then it did find its way back into history. Does anybody recognize this distinguished-looking gentleman? Well, you can see we're moving pretty rapidly here. We've already gone from 4000 BC up to the late 1700s. By the late 1700s, on the Upper West Side here, there were a series of estates. I'm only going to show you two of them. One of them is associated with this gentleman. There was no villages yet. They come shortly, but there were a series of estates. The one associated with this gentleman, this is Brockhost Livingston. He's part of the Livingston family, and he was actually a Supreme Court Justice in the Marshall Court. So he was pretty significant. Try the next one. This is another one of these estate or mansion buildings in the neighborhood at the time. This is the mansion of Dr. Valentine Mott. Here's a picture of the distinguished Dr. Valentine Mott. He's the father of American vascular surgery, if you're interested. Does anybody know who this is? Yeah, this is Dewitt Clinton. And one very interesting thing about Dewitt Clinton that really affects not only our neighborhood, but most of Manhattan is in 1811, he commissions a Colonel John Randall to go and survey the land up north in Manhattan so that they can get a little more organized with the development of Manhattan. And in doing that, what comes out of it is something that's today called either the Randall Grid or the grid plan of New York City. So, we go from streets 1 up to 225th Street, if you've ever walked up Broadway, and we go from avenues 1 through 12. That's all because of Dewitt Clinton having the city survey. The oldest streets were obviously grandfathered, all the streets in the West Village and certainly Wall Street and all of that. But the grid is very, very important for a whole bunch of reasons. One is it really spurs development, because once they have the grid pattern, then all of the blocks that we know today are broken up into lots, and the lots, which are 25 feet by 100 feet, start to encourage a lot of development and whatnot. About 2 years ago, somebody raised the question, well, when they did the survey, was there anything left over from the 1811 survey? There might have been survey markers and whatnot, and lo and behold, they found what we think are two of them. If you walk into Central Park at what would be the intersection of 66th Street and 6th Avenue, there's a bolt in the rock there with a square top on, and we think, it still has to be verified, we think that's one of the Randall bolts from 1811. There's another one we think, subject to verification, up at about 104th Street and where it would intersect with 6th Avenue. So, but now the community on the Upper West Side, the communities on the West Side really start with this family. This is the Harson family farmhouse. Jacob Harson came into the neighborhood in 1763. And by the early 1800s, there's a small community at about 71st Street and Broadway called Harsonville. In fact, one of the few roads that went from the west side over to the east side, this is before Central Park, was Harson Lane. And that came from here. We actually, again, I keep going back to the historical society, we actually have things that were in that house in the historical society. And at that point in time, or shortly thereafter, two other very small communities began also. One was called Stryker at about 96th Street and Broadway, and the other was Bloomingdale as a very, very small village at about 100th Street and Broadway. In Harsonville, there were all of maybe 500 people in the early 1800s living, but that was the earliest community in our area. There was a glassworks there was an iron foundry, there was a company that is thought to be the first silk ribbon manufacturer in the United States. It's really fascinating early history that hasn't been projected enough. I show you this map just to emphasize how little there was, because this shows the very few houses that were even in the area. Here's that Harsonville Road I was talking about that went across Central Park, which was not yet built yet. You can even see the lake in Central Park, and there's an old water course there that was actually called Woman's Pond for a while. When they finally built Central Park, women, for reasons of privacy, would ice skate on that water there. And then there's another little pond up in what is Manhattan Square. Manhattan Square winds up becoming the Museum of Natural History site. So, just a few more buildings from that area. Burnham's Hotel, which is at the corner of, southwest corner of 79th Street and Broadway. This eventually falls into the family of the descendants of the Apthorpe family, the Vanderhovels. And one of their descendants in turn was William Waldorf Astor. So eventually when the Apthorpe gets built as the world's largest apartment building, it's on the site of this because of the family lineage. And a little further up Broadway, at about 100th Street, is this old Abbey Hotel. And now, here's, anybody ever hear of a song called, you can't see it at the top, I'm sorry to say, Woodman Spare This Tree? Bill, you're laughing. Have you heard this song?
Yes.
You have? Can you sing it? This is, in my humble opinion, the first environmental protest song ever written. This was on, thought to be on the Stryker Mansion estate, and it was an oak tree at what is approximately 97th Street and West End Avenue, and a very famous early New York City poet, George Pope Morris, wrote a pretty famous poem about it called Woodman Spare This Tree. And the story is simply that they're ready to knock down the tree, and he says, well, don't tear it down because it has a lot of meaning for me. A fellow named Henry Russell, a great English composer, turned it into a song 7 years later in 1837. And then, believe it or not, Irving Berlin, another Upper West Sider, actually wrote an intro to the song in 1911 and lopped it onto Broadway. So, I hate to do this to you, but I'm actually going to sing a verse from it. And if you recognize it, please make a large contribution to the Park West History Movement. And I don't have it. I went to like the Andy Devine School of Singing, so. But it went like this. Woodman spare this tree, touch not a single bough. In youth it sheltered me, and I'll protect it now. It actually was an extremely popular parlor song in the 1800s. Many people knew it. It was very standard sheet music, and it's a delightful tune. There's a number of really good recordings. I'd recommend one by Richard Dyer Bennett, if anybody remembers that name.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Try the next one. So Central Park finally gets envisioned and created, starting in the late 1850s. And that has tremendous implications for the city and for our neighborhood. I'll just point out one thing. All the way up in the upper right-hand corner there is the most northern region of Central Park at the time, 106th Street. I say 106th Street because the city shortly thereafter, or rather the Central Park Commission, which was a state phenomenon, wound up buying more land to go up to 110th Street. But that little building that you might be able to see in the upper right-hand corner is Mount St. Vincent. If you ever walk in the northern part of the park, and again, over by 6th Avenue and 106th Street, you'll see the foundations for Mount St. Vincent. They left the park in that time period. They went up to Riverdale, where they have a fabulous campus. The building stayed, and it became like a home for Civil War veterans. And then it was engulfed in a tremendous fire in the late 1880s, I believe. So the building's been gone for a long time. You can actually go up there and see the foundation of the building. They've actually, the park has done some wonderful signage for that. This is the Mount St. Vincent I'm talking about. It was the very large institution that was up there. It's another large institution in our area. I'm sorry I don't have a better focus to this, because what I did is I took an image of a painting of what this is and then just tried to expand it. So again, I apologize. But this is the Lion Brewery. This was a brewery that occupied 4 blocks between 8th Avenue and 10th Avenue. 8th Avenue was not yet renamed as Central Park West. But between 8th and 10th Avenue and between 107th Street and 109th Street, this was a very large brewery. Over time, the brewery got a little more condensed into just 1 block between Columbus and Amsterdam and 107th and 108th Street. It's where Booker T, the junior high school is, if you go there. And in fact, the brewmaster of this was on the north side of 108th Street, and it's a little vest pocket type park. So, with this Lion Brewery, and this painting was done in 1875, with this Lion Brewery, they had an ale house on the corner of 110th and Broadway, which is very, very popular with the building community as well as with the Columbia students. Obviously, that's not there anymore, but if you walk on Broadway at 97th Street, the northwest corner, you'll see Sleepy's. The building that Sleepy's is in is an old ale house from the same period. That will give you a sense of what it is. This is Bloomingdale before the Bloomingdale Road before the subway, which by now gets renamed first the Boulevard and then finally Broadway. And it becomes a huge, majestic thoroughfare. There's an omnibus going through there. There's a park in the middle. You can actually walk the park from, Columbus Circle, 60th Street, as far north as 120th Street. Here's Riverside Drive. Both Riverside Drive and the widening of Broadway all happened almost as an outgrowth of Central Park with a lot of city pride. And of course, the Museum of Natural History. I've just tried to get an old image of it here. And here too, you're not going to see as much detail as I'd like to show you, but this is one of the old ward maps. This area was called the 12th Ward. But what I will show you is just to maybe whet your interest a little bit. Like Gil and I feed on this stuff. We go home like 3 o'clock in the morning. We read these maps. But here's that famous S curve on the 9th Avenue L. You may have seen pictures of that. So the railroad's coming north here, and then it gets up to 110th Street, and then it goes over to 8th Avenue. So that's the 9th Avenue elevated subway. 9th Avenue obviously gets renamed Columbus Avenue. There's the boulevard you can see up there, but slightly south of it are the remnants of the old Bloomingdale Road. And when Gil does walking tours in the area, he points out a couple of angles on buildings that harken back to that old Bloomingdale Road, because the properties are not, are not squared with the avenues. Similarly, this line here is the old Croton Aqueduct, which heads up this way to go underneath Amsterdam Avenue. There too, less than a block and a half away, and I think it's in that direction, we're talking maybe 200-300 yards at most, you can see building angles that pay homage to the path of the old Croton Aqueduct. So, and then what you might also see is just a wide variety of these old country-type lanes that were just all over the place. But by now, each of the blocks have been put into place in accordance with that grid plan, and then there's a tremendous amount of development. So here's a shot of the 9th Avenue L from the top, people getting on the L. And here's a shot from the bottom. Now, this is actually up at 112th Street. But it shows, it gives some sense, I think, that if the L passed your block on 92nd Street or 104th Street or whatever, it really shadowed, it really colored, darkened, the immediate neighborhood. So, at this point in time, the Upper West Side is developing very, very rapidly. Everybody knows the Dakota. I tried to get a nice old print at the get-go. Clark, who develops the Dakota, does a lot of surrounding buildings. This is a building, if you don't know it, and you happen to be down on 85th Street, just west of Columbus, take a look at this building. My personal photograph, which I took here, doesn't do it justice. This is the Brockholst. This is named after that good-looking chap about 20 slides ago, Brockholst Livingston. This is in honor of him. Another one, of course, is the Apthorpe that we spoke about. This was, when it opened, the largest apartment building in the world. Within a year, there was another building that became the largest apartment building in the world, and that's the Belmore, just 7 blocks north. Try another one. So, by now, we're ready for the subway. We don't have the subway yet. I wanted to show you what Broadway looked at just before the subway. So this is at about 71st Street on Broadway, looking south. Here's the park that goes right through it. You could walk the length of Broadway right in the middle there. In the background, that darkened area, is the 9th Avenue L. And now, after the subway comes in, the street top starts to take on a different flavor. Today, we know in the medium and Broadway, it's raised up a little bit with these plantings and whatnot. That pretty much began right at the get-go in 1904 when the subway came. Here's a favorite building of a favorite architect of mine, and that's Emery Roth. Emery Roth lived 2 blocks away from here at the Alden Apartments on 102nd Street, I believe. He designed this building, which you might recognize from the southwest corner of 76th and Broadway. This is the Belclair. This actually had a golf course connected to it out in Bayside, Queens, the Belclair Golf Course, one of the luxury apartments on the Upper West Side. By now, the Upper West Side not only becomes the most concentrated area in the world of luxury apartments, but it becomes the most concentrated area in the world of large apartment buildings. Emery Roth, who did this building, of course, is most famous for defining the Central Park skyline. Landmarks West makes a major and very important point that when you peer out at the Central Park West from, say, the east or from Central Park, you're looking at the San Remo, the El Dorado, the Beresford. Those are all Emery Roth buildings. And again, he lived, about a block away from here. I showed this church building, which is St. Agnes Chapel. I showed this building when I first gave a talk like this at the reopening of the St. Agnes Library, because that begged the question, how did St. Agnes Library get its name? Well, it got its name from this church. This is one of the Upper West Side's fabulous churches. This doesn't exist anymore. This actually came down in 1948. We know that just in a few blocks here, we have the wonderful St. Michael's and now Park West Presbyterian. We have our own fabulous churches, and that's without even mentioning the cathedral and whatnot. But this church in its day was thought to be one of the two most beautiful church buildings in the city, along with St. Patrick's Cathedral by many people. And here's just a picture of that St. Agnes library. And since that was done with Carnegie money, I threw a picture of Mr. Andrew Carnegie, is the way to pronounce it. I threw that up here, but in no small part because the fellow who wrote the definitive book now on Andrew Carnegie is an acquaintance of yours, Bill, right? David Nassau.
Yeah.
He's the Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Professor at the City University Graduate Study. And he lives like 2 blocks away from here. The definitive book now on New York Revolutionary War history is by Arnett Schechter, who lives on 107th Street, not too far from here. So people who are writing about much of history actually live amongst us. So I want to show you just 4 books that I find to be very worthwhile in terms of Upper West Side history. And I thank you for bearing with me in going through this part of the presentation very, very quickly. Because after I show you these 4 books, we're going to have a real treat from Orfeo Duo from our neighborhood. They make music in the neighborhood, in the community, in a very interesting way. And then after that, I have some more interesting stuff to show you. And I'm actually going to bring out a guitar, and we're going to do a little more music as it relates to history. So that was our intention to get through a bit of this. So here's the first book, The Upper West Side Story by Peter Sallard. It's a little bit dated, but it's in the library. Upper West Side just came out last year. Michael Susi has done a couple of presentations, like at the New York Historical Society and a few other places. It's a fabulous picture card collection, but with good commentary about our neighborhood. And it will dazzle you with images that you have not seen anywhere else, simply because he's collected these pretty obscure postcards. Another real favorite one of mine, he still writes for the New York Times. He writes some financial, architectural / real estate stuff. But David Dunlap wrote a book called On Broadway, where he goes from the bottom end of Broadway all the way up to the Harlem River, the North End. And in our neighborhood, he goes building by building. And he's got wonderful pictures, images, and good detailed history. And the last book, of course, Andrew S. Dolkart, who's a professor at Columbia in charge of the historic preservation effort up there, has written this great book, Morningside Heights. And even though it's slightly north of here, it gives more than enough information about even this neighborhood that you'll find incredibly insightful. So, Vida, Ishmael, this is Orfeo Duo. This is going to be some neat entertainment. They do, and I'm going to try to explain this, they do a tradition that you might be familiar with in Australia, which is songlines. Songlines is when you touch base with people in a community, in an area, and you have them begin to sing about their experiences and the history of what they know in the city. And they do much, much more than that. But you're going to treat us with a piece from 113th Street in Broadway?
111.
111, okay, wonderful.
We're going to sing first and explain later.
And you can go to their website, just Google Orfeo Duo.
helps to set a tone, that helps to make my life complete. I like to travel, see the sights, swim the seas, and scale the heights. I sampled bread, London, traveled through Paris, and had a taste of Rome. But 111th Street and Broadway is my by a friend of ours who is named Peter Hellmann, and he's a composer who lives on 111th Street. We hail from very far away, 113th Street.
So we've been collecting neighbors together in the summer to write songs on the street and sing them on the street. And Peter joined us in this fun activity last summer and wrote this song for strolling down the block, usually without accordion.
So we hope you will all join us and write songs to go with blocks that you know and love.
Or contribute material for the lyrics, even if you don't write your own song. So thank you.
That was incredible. I had heard so many good things about them that I had expectations here, and it's like they came in like, wait, that was just incredible. Peter, there's going to be some street fair stuff, right, on the weekends of May 16th, Sunday, May 16th, and the 23rd, right?
Correct. On Amsterdam, between 106th and 110th, the Park West History Neighborhood Group will be out there. Vida and her brother Ishmael will be out there. We may even get a piano. We're trying. So we'll see what we can do on that.
That's fabulous. And you know, from the history group standpoint, we just love the idea that we're documenting our neighborhood and in such an interesting way with music like that.
Jim, I'll say one other thing. Vida and Ishmael have been doing a series called What a Neighborhood for a number of years, and they've worked with a number of churches and congregations within those churches to produce events at Trinity Lutheran, Ascension, Broadway Presbyterian, St. Mary's Episcopal up on 126th Street, and they've been pulling together community groups. I know on June 21st, the Make Music New York, a couple of years ago at least, I'm not sure about last year, they had a kazoo choir that was put together out of the community lunch program at Broadway Presbyterian, and they performed outside for that. And so it's just very fun stuff.
And they've done wonderful things for the Welsh at Rutgers Presbyterian Church.
Okay, very good.
Now I want to embarrass a few people. I want to embarrass my fellow Park West Neighborhood History Group members, like Pam. Yeah. Pam Tudge. There she is. Can you stand up just so people... Yay! Anna Fields, working the desk back. Usually Lynn Armstrong. And Lynn's going to take a community award on behalf of herself and our group on May 1st down at Riverside. So that's fabulous. And Barbara Ernst. Barbara? Yeah. Peter Aronson, of course, working this camera here. and myself, and Mary Lee Barringer,
And Jim Terrain?
What?
Jim Terrain?
Oh,
with
yeah,
the.
well, we're gonna get up to Jim Terrain.
Oh, I see. Okay,
Yeah.
we're building up towards him.
Jim Terrain, you know, if we're all, Jim, how can I put this? Jim is the melody and we're all the notes.
Okay.
Understand that? We're gonna highlight Jim just in a short while because we're gonna lead up to that. So let's take a look at what we got next here on the slides. You don't have to read this, but I'll tell you that the first automobile fatality happened on the Upper West Side, the corner of 74th Street and Central Park West in 1899. They took poor Mr. West to Riverside Hospital, to Roosevelt Hospital, and just didn't make it. This plaque is not there anymore, it's lost, maybe for good reason. Excellent. Yes. This is the U.S. Open. And when I delve into history, I get astounded by things like this. The West Side Tennis Club started on between 88th and 89th Street on Central Park West in 1892. They actually built 3 clay courts there, but then the real estate became so valuable they had to move. They moved quickly up to by Columbia University, 118th Street and Broadway. And then they wound up moving out to Forest Hills in 1914, where they built a stadium that holds 14,000 people and a clubhouse. And then they inherited the U.S. Open from the tennis club up in Newport, Rhode Island, the casino group up there. And the rest, as they say, is history. From that point on, the U.S. Open is connected with the West Side Tennis Organization. In 1978, they then moved to Flushing Meadow. And even there, the stadium, I think, was designed by an Upper West Sider, David Kenneth Spector, a prominent architect. So that connects back to our neighborhood. Hellmann's, everybody know about Hellmann's connection? Hellmann's was first sold on at a little shop by, I think his name was Richard Hellmann, 84th Street in Columbus. Put that in there, put that feather. Any notion at all what this is? This is another favorite story of mine relating to the Upper West Side. A fella, you know Fleischmann's, right? Most people know Fleischmann's Yeast, right? Fleischmann's Yeast is Charles Fleischmann. He goes to Cincinnati and he starts Fleischmann's Yeast. His brother, Leo Fleischmann, comes to New York. First he goes to Philadelphia, but he comes to New York and he sets up a bakery here. And in the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, he has a display. If you've ever been to a World's Fair like at Flushing Meadows, you know they have these big elaborate displays. Well, he displays a Viennese bakery, and it becomes so popular that he in effect brings the whole concept of the bakery as we know it, we take it for granted, but he brings it into the United States. And then he's in New York, he's producing baked goods, he's producing a lot of bread, and that's what he's doing in New York. But at the end of the day, when he had bread left over, he would donate it to local hospitals. The shop was actually down at Broadway and about 11th Street. And then he came up with a brilliant idea. It's too bad we don't have ideas like this anymore. He gives the bread away to people that can really use it, and he coins the term bread line. That all originates with Leo Fleischmann. The story doesn't end there, though. But one of his sons winds up becoming a prominent developer of the Grand Concourse up in the Bronx. Another one, Ralph Fleischmann, becomes the first publisher of the New Yorker magazine, you know, with Mr. Ross, right? And Fleischmann is the principal money behind the New Yorker from the get-go. So, try the next one. The Muppets, why would we show the Muppets here? Well, because they got created at the, what was called in its day, the old Republic Theater at 81st Street and Broadway, you know, before PBS adapted it and changed and moved to other areas. But another really powerful image is this fella. When we talk in our history, we're always astounded by the fact that Rockwell, this great illustrator, and he didn't invent Superman, of course, But Norman Rockwell, the great illustrator, was born a couple hundred feet away from here in a building that's still there called the Claremont, 854 Amsterdam Avenue. On the 5th floor, you think in the back, right? It's still there like that. So he starts very closely. Anybody know who this guy is?
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell me anything about him that I don't know already?
He had a pimple in his left arm.
What was that?
He had a pimple in his left arm.
He's got a pimple. This is Frank Loesser. There's, you might be able to see that he was born on June 29, 1910. So this June, he'll be 100 years old. It looks like they're going to have a stamp for him, but I don't think that's the case. I think the stamp was a creation of a bunch of people on Broadway that wanted to pay homage to him, including his wife, Jo, who's still alive, and a number of Broadway notables, and also Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney is a big Frank Loesser fan. So I want to do a Frank Loesser song, if that's okay. Any requests?
Adelaide's Lament.
A poison can develop a cold. I got the horse right here. My name is Paul Rubin. Most people know. That's the last time I rent a guitar. A lot of people, the first time they start horsing around on the piano, play either chopsticks or Heart and Soul. That's a very early Frank Loesser song with the music written by the great Hoagy Carmichael from Indiana. But why do we even call attention to him? Well, he grew up very close, very nearby on 14 West 107th Street. The building's still there. So I'd like to think, I mean, he's written, you can kind of see it there. He wrote, the music, the words to How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying, with Most Happy Fella, Where's Charlie, Hans Christian Andersen. His most famous one is probably the one at the top, Guys and Dolls, which is loosely based on the stories by Damon Runyon. Damon Runyon lived in this neighborhood on 102nd Street, as well as, I think, 95th Street. But Frank Loesser lived at, as I said, 14 West 107th Street. And that was his boyhood home. And I'd like to think that when he was growing up, he got an idea for a song when he was a little kid. And he wasn't writing songs when he was 8 years old, obviously. But eventually, I'd like to think, I'm going to romanticize, that it actually turns itself into this song, which hopefully you'll recognize. And you can join right in. This is not a complicated song. Standing on the corner, watching all the girls go by. Standing on the corner, watching all the girls go by. But if you go get a moderation in the world, give it a try. Try standing on the corner, watching all the girls go by. Everybody know that song? Try the next one, Mary Lee. Anybody know who this is?
The Educator.
The Educator? Eddie Friedan. I really think, I read the book, I was a teenager in 1964 when I read Feminine Mystique. And this, like Jane Jacobs' book, Life and Death of Great American Cities, in my humble opinion, is a transformative book. After you read that book, you see things very, very differently. And I think that's how powerful a force she was. I can also tell you, when I used to jog in the bottom end of Central Park, occasionally I would be jogging behind her. She actually jogged seemingly every day. You know, other people tell stories about jogging around the reservoir around Jacqueline Kennedy, but Betty Friedan, believe it or not, jogged in Central Park. Try another one? Anybody know him? Yeah, Great Miles. If you go to the Jazz Hall of Fame, Jazz in Lincoln Center, he's one of the early inductees. And it's incredible how many of those great inductees, it's almost the pantheon of jazz, connect with the Upper West Side. Obviously, Duke Ellington, John Coltrane lived in the neighborhood for a brief while. He's usually connected more with Philadelphia, but he had a presence here. Max Roach and Abbey Hotel, Billie Holiday. The list is really, really endless as to who lived here. And of course, the great Miles Davis. How about this woman?
Edith.
No.
No?
Yeah. How did you know that?
Edith Wharton?
Edith Wharton.
Well, she and I,
It all comes out. There's a woman here from Columbia University, I think, that's writing an article. Okay, I was going to suggest they play up the part where Bill Herman has dated Edith Wharton. But, you know, she died in France in 1937, but her last U.S. address was on West 85th Street. So not too many people know that. Try another one right here. Anybody know this fine-looking gentleman? Well, if you read the New York Times this morning, you might recognize Adolph Oakes. He brings the Oakes and eventually Sulzberger families to New York and makes it into one of the world's great newspapers. Before him, Leonard Jerome owned the New York Times for a while with some other investors, and of course the founder, Henry Raymond, owned it at the get-go in 1851 or 52, but he was a giant that lived in our neighborhood. How about Harry? Harry's still in the neighborhood. I once accidentally sat next to him at the New York Historical Society, and boy, does he like to chat. But the one story about him that really brought home his import to me was, if you read, there's a 3-volume set of books by Taylor Branch about the modern civil rights movement. And in one of them, there's a section about John F. Kennedy comes to New York to campaign. And at this point, it's not clear that the black or African community is going to do much for the Democrats. In fact, many famous African Americans had Republican connections, even with then Vice President Nixon. Jackie Robinson, a lot of people were bent more towards the Republican side. But John F. Kennedy was astute enough to say, hey, look, we got to start making a connection here. And within a half hour, his people made a call, and he was in Harry Belafonte's apartment. They were actually strategizing about, how to get a stronger connection going there. How about her? She's a little tougher. She's a giant. Clara Martin is a good guest. But now, poet now. Stanton? What was that name?
Stanton?
Say again?
Cady Stanton?
Yes. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she, along with Susan B. Anthony and maybe Lucretia Mott, that's the foundation for the suffragette movement and getting the vote and whatnot. She actually died in a building on 94th Street in Broadway. If you go there today, you'll see this building called the Stanton. Paying homage to her. Yes, how can we leave them out? He's been all over the place. There's the Poe Cottage in the Bronx. He died in Baltimore. He's got connections with London. Even a few years ago, there was a problem with a building he was associated with on West 3rd Street. But he famously lived in our neighborhood on West 84th Street. There's actually a plaque there. And it's, I think, reasonably well documented that when he was there, he wrote at least one famous poem, To Helen. That's the one that has that phrase, can you help me on this one, Bill? Something like the fate, it's not the face that launched 1,000 ships, it's something like that. But he's obviously a giant. Let's try another one. How about this guy? This is a favorite of mine, Teddy Wilson. Yeah. Teddy, most people might know him as being part of the famous Benny Goodman trio, or quartet, after they added Lionel Hampton, but he's in that absolutely key 1938 Carnegie Hall concert that, brings swing into the popular domain. But he did so much else. He also supported supported Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday on a number of their recordings, and he played with all the greats. Try another one. Anybody know this one?
Is that Arendt?
Yeah. She lived in my building, 370 Riverside Drive. Yeah. Hannah Arendt. Yeah. She's like a political theorist. Sometimes she's described as a philosopher. She didn't like that. She didn't claim to write philosophy. She had relationships with philosophers, if you know anything about her. She liked to, she wrote The Human Condition is pretty famous, and also The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she identified its evil roots. She's indeed a giant. How about this guy? It's another giant, grossly underknown, at least in our neighborhood. It's not Conan O'Brien. It looks a little bit like him, doesn't it? Yeah. This is Benjamin Cardozo. Yeah. He lived on West 75th Street. Along with legal scholars seem to think that Judge Learned Hand, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who was the Chief Justice at the time, and Benjamin Cardozo were the three great judges of the 20th century. In fact, he replaced Oliver Wendell Holmes on the court. Oliver Wendell Holmes was 90 years old at the time, and another Upper West Sider, Charles Evans Hughes, who lived down West End of 74th Street, had the unenviable task of having to, he was a justice at the time, but his task was to talk to Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and convince him to retire. And when he did, then it was a no-brainer that they asked Judge Cardozo to join the court. So, anybody know what this is? We're back to buildings here.
Oh, that's the back end of,
The Dakota? No.
yeah, St. Luke's, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the back end of something. And if we flip the slide around, we'll see the front end of something. But Joanna, you're onto something.
It's not the back end of St. Luke's?
No, boy, you're so close. That's Woman, Gil got it. Yeah, Gil wins a macaroon. That's Woman's Hospital. It technically had an address on 109th Street, but here's the 110th Street side. So that building on the left is still there. I think that's 412 West 110th Street. That retaining wall over here,
Right.
that's still there. If you ever walk down 110th Street, you'll see that. But here's a book that's yet to be written. The book is going to be something like The Important Hospitals on the Upper West Side of this area. And it's going to be Women's Hospital. This was the first women's hospital in the United States. This was founded by J. Marion Sims. He's an interesting character, but he's the father of American gynecology. He's very renowned. And then, I mean, just to close the loop on this not only the building came down, but this became incorporated into the St. Luke's community, which in turn became part of Continuum Health Partners. So there were a whole bunch of other medical establishments in this very immediate area. There was New York School of Medicine had a woman's facility on West 101st Street. right off Central Park West. We know there was the Pond Hospital, which was at 100th Street and Central Park West. And in connection with that, there was something called the Reconstruction Hospital. There was something called the Pasteur Institute at 97th Street. There was St. Luke's, obviously. There was something called the Radium Institute on, I think, 328 Riverside Drive for a brief while. If anybody read the science section of the New York Times this week, you might have seen there was a, I'm going to be slightly wrong on the name, John B. Towns Hospital, 293 Central Park West. As soon as I saw that, this is this week's Times in the science section, I said, where did this come from? Who the heck ever heard of this hospital? And then I find out it's the first hospital in the United States that's dealing with drug addiction. This fella Towns actually was renowned in his day, went over to China, believe it or not, set up 3 hospitals there and studied opium addiction and how to deal with it. So, and then probably the most important hospital in the whole area, and we can flip ahead to this. This is not the New York Cancer Hospital, which people know the building, at least on 106th and Central Park West, right? Yep. Later on it became the Towers Nursing Home, right? And this kind of morphed into and moved over to the Far East Side. It became Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital. But what I'm showing you here is the very specific building in the Loire Valley in France that the architect used to design the building. There's a much bigger story here, and when somebody writes the book, maybe Bill and I will write the book, there's a whole thing about the pavilion style of hospitals where you have rounded parts so the germs can't get stuck in a corner, stuff like that. The New York Cancer Hospital, though, in its day, had the largest supply of radium in the world. There was only 4 stuff. This building is shown because Decca Records actually used the Pythian Temple for a lot of their recordings. If you know Buddy Holly, and I'm a card-carrying member of the Buddy Holly Memorial Society, all of his last recordings were done in this building. Rock Around the Clock might have been recorded in this building. Now, that's not the earliest rock and roll song, believe me, there are a lot of things before that, but that has a lot of rock and roll history. And also, as part of Decca Records, there are a couple of subsidiary labels. Brunswick, Coral was another one. And a hit was on Coral Records in 1957. Giant hit for the year is written by the guy who's in the next slide. But let's not get there yet. The guy in the next slide lived and died at 12 West 96th Street, not too far from here. You will not know his name, but I'm going to mention it and start to popularize his name. Fred Alherd. Fred Alherd, he wrote songs like Mean to Me, Why Must You Be Mean to Me? Or I Don't Know Why I Love You Like I Do, I Don't Know Why I Just Do. Or he wrote, Gee, but it's great after staying out late, walking my baby back home. If you know any of these songs. He wrote Bing Crosby's signature song, you know, when the blue of the dawn meets the gold of the day, someone waits for me. But that's not the song we're going to do. We're going to do a song. We're going to do a song from 1935 written by Fred Alherd, and we'll look at him now. And it's a song on the right there. It was made famous in 1957. It's a rock and roll song by Billy Williams. I'm going to sit right down and write myself a letter and take Billy the game from you. All the right words are so sweet. They're going to knock me off my feet. My kisses on the bottom. I'll be glad I go. I'm going to smile and say, I hope you're feeling better. And close with love the way that you do. I'll sit right down and write myself a letter. Oh yeah, and maybe it came from you. most Fats of all of them. I looked to see if Fats lived in our neighborhood, and he didn't. Fats, he didn't live too far from here. He was actually, like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., he was the son of one of the ministers up at Abyssinian Baptist Church. So, have any of you seen the brochure on Park West Village?
It's at the table.
Okay, there's some at the table in the back. If you haven't looked at it recently, or if you've never seen it, get yourself dazzled by seeing some of the famous people that lived in Park West Village. And I'm talking like the Wilt Chamberlains, I'm talking like the Max Roaches, I'm talking like Ray Charles. I mean, there are real giants there. Jim, you're looking at it now. You see any names there?
Brandon Hawkins,
Oh,
Ryan Lear,
say next one.
Ryan Lear,
Ryan Blair, yeah.
Tony Barker.
Marion McKeevan,
Marion McKeevan, Hugh Muscala.
Joseph Wiseman, Mike Mankiewicz,
Joseph Weisman, the actor.
Joseph Wiseman,
Yeah.
Odetta, Silo, Tito Puente,
Oh,
Blaine Stritch, Bob Tees, Steve Tyson.
yeah. But if you think that's astounding, and clearly that's that could be a book, that could be a movie, that could be a TV show, that could be something. The most astounding thing, I think, my humble opinion that happened on the Upper West Side, is a special block and a half, or 2 blocks, called the Old Community. And the Old Community is West 99th Street and West 98th Street, between Central Park West and Columbus Avenue. This is a community that started approximately 1904 or so, and lasted right up to the time that Park West Village got constructed. So Park West Village, as you know, it's a real simple history. It was part of urban development, and a lot of buildings came down, and then they built new buildings. This old community was such a spectacular experience for people that grew up there that it has created all sorts of historic, notable success stories and associations. And the people that live there, the people that connect to that are just absolutely incredible. Like people like Billie Holiday, or if you know any vaudeville history, Walker and Williams. Bert Williams, probably the most famous vaudeville performer ever. His famous song "Nobody" and whatnot comes out of that block. Butterfly McQueen, in Gone with the Wind, she has kind of a somewhat significant role there, but she had done much other stuff, and she had done many movies after that. The list of people on that block is absolutely incredible. In the realm of rock and roll, which is just one thing, a group that had the number 5 hit for the entire year of 1956. So this is the first big year for rock and roll, and there's songs like Love Me Tender and Wayward Wind, and it's the first year of all the big Little Richard hits like One Tone Sally and Tutti Frutti and all that stuff. I can tell you that the number of hits in the top 10 were songs like The Great Pretender and Why Do Fools Fall in Love and Honky Tonk and Elvis Presley's Don't Be Cruel. And this song by a group called The Channels, Earl Lewis and the Channels, was a song called The Closer You Are. That was the number 5 hit in New York City of that year. And for those of us that get a little bit into rock and roll and doo-wop history, that's arguably the song that creates the new standard of if you have a song coming out in rock and roll, you now have to put falsetto into the song. Because Earl Lewis and the Channels does this incredible falsetto thing and kind of popularizes it. And the bass singer who grew up on West 99th Street, Clifford Wright, also in the group, is part of this lineage. But the next slide is going to show you arguably the most important person from that community. And again, the old community. Jim Terrain, you stand up for a second? Yeah. Jim here is my historical source, but Jim is much bigger than this Jim. He's the man who keeps the history, keeps the community going. Jim lived on the block from 1941 to 55, right up to the time that, you know, the buildings came down and whatnot. Yeah. And Jim keeps a whole bunch of people in touch. Sometimes when we do presentations, a lot of people come back. We're talking like 55 years ago. This incredible legacy on West 99th Street and 98th Street is just unbelievable. This is definitely a book to be written. And again, it could be a TV show, it could be a movie. And all I'm going to do, because we're just whetting your appetite here, we just want to show you this fella. Now, if anybody knows this fella, other than you, Jim, you're definitely going to get something, like dinner or something. Any wild guesses? I wouldn't expect you to know this, but he's a giant. Yeah? This is Philip Payton. Philip Payton comes to the block. He's hired by a woman named Mary Sullivan, an Irish woman obviously, who gets into a little bit of a spite thing with one of her neighbors, and she hires Philip Payton to populate the building with blacks. So it's a horrible part of our history here, but what it does is it touches upon Philip Payton, who at the same time does something similar in Harlem, and soon thereafter creates the Afro-American Realty Company, which in the annals of Harlem history is what really opens up Harlem to African Americans coming up from the South. And that leads to all that's great about Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance, and it's such a key essential part of New York City history. The missing piece is the fact that Philip Payton really begins on West 99th Street. He was so successful, and of course he looked like a very prominent businessman here, which he was. He was so successful that he wound up owning, I think, 4 buildings on the block. So definitely.
Jim, what was the date of the beginning of the population of Harlem?
The date of the beginning of the population of Harlem is actually probably the 1880s or so. Because in the grandest scheme of things, although the subway didn't come up Broadway till 1904, the elevated lines came up 3rd Avenue, 6th Avenue, 9th Avenue. Some of them came up in the 1870s, and by early 1880s, there were elevated subways up 3rd, 6th, and 9th, and then a little bit later on, the 2nd Avenue subway. And some of them, of course, as we know, even went further up into the Bronx. So those populated Harlem, a lot of the East Side and whatnot. But on the West Side, it was a little more problematic. Andrew Docart in his book covers that kind of nicely, how, ironically, Morningside Heights and some of our neighborhood doesn't get populated as much as like Harlem, which is north of us. Any other questions about any of the history that we covered? We try to have some fun. I do want to leave you with the last thought with Philip Payton, because I think this is history yet to be written. There's a lot of very great significance with what we're looking at here. And I thank you so much for